Hi, I love sewing, but there are some surprising realities that I didn't necessarily realize when I first started sewing. I didn't really have a clear picture of all that was involved. Now, although sewing is fun, it's not all sunshine and roses. Luckily, I enjoy all the things that are involved with the sewing process, so it wasn't a problem for me, but it could be a game changer for you. Additionally, there were some things that I was doing the hard way and some that were simply misguided. So, if you want to have an idea of what's involved in sewing and avoid some common mistakes, then this video is for you. So here's 10 things that I wish that I knew before I started sewing. And stick around to the end because I saved the best for last. So the first reality check is that more time is typically spent cutting and pressing than actually at the sewing machine. I know, crazy, right? So here's the thing. You got this nice new sewing machine you think are going to be spending all of your time at the sewing machine, creating beautiful projects left and right. Wrong. In reality, the time spent at the sewing machine is typically only about 20% of the project for me. So what's actually involved in the sewing process? Well, obviously it depends on the project, but here's a breakdown of some general things that most of my projects seem to involve and about how much time is spent on those tasks. For me, I tend to like to design my own patterns and come up with my own ideas. Therefore, the first step is designing the pattern. And it takes a significant chunk of time to figure out all the pieces for the pattern, the measurements, and how things fit together before I start drawing. And I'll typically start a rough draft on tracing paper just in case something doesn't work out. And then once I finalize the details, I'll then copy it onto my pattern making paper. Next, I like to go ahead and press or iron the piece of fabric that I'll be using for the project to help ensure that it lays flat during the cutting process. This helps ensure accurate measurements and a clean cut. Now, this doesn't take too long if you're using something like a fat quarter. What's a fat quarter, you may ask? Well, a fat quarter is a pre-cut rectangular piece of fabric that usually measures about 19 to 22 inches. Anyway, so not a lot of time involved if you're using a fat quarter for your project, but it can really take some time to do this if you're working with a large piece of fabric, especially like a full skirt. Next, it's time to cut out the pattern and all the little pieces. Now, this can take anywhere from a half an hour to several hours, depending on what's being made and the size of the project. For example, when I'm making a water bottle holder, it might only take me a half an hour to cut everything out. But when I was making the bike trunk cooler bag, it took me 4+ hours to do all of the cutting. It was insane. Now, once all the cutting is done, there will likely be multiple trips back and forth between the sewing machine and the iron. Every time I need to fold something or I need a seam to lay flat or to make sure something is smooth, I head back to the iron. And of course, there's also the time spent pinning things. Now, if your project requires iron-on interfacing, applique, iron-on vinyl laminate, bias tape, or a lot of folds or hemming, then you'll likely spend significantly more time at the iron. So to get an idea of how much time you might actually spend at the sewing machine, an example is when I make a water bottle holder. It might take me about an hour to do the full process of creating a water bottle holder, but maybe only about 20 minutes might be spent at the machine. The rest of the time is spent cutting, pinning, ironing at various stages of the process. Now, I happen to enjoy all of the stages of the creative sewing process. But if you lack patience for all the steps, or you find that spending the majority of your time on cutting and pressing sounds incredibly boring or frustrating, then sewing might not be the best place for you to express your creativity. The second thing is that sewing can actually be hazardous, and it might not be hazardous in quite the ways that you would think. For example, many people think that there is a risk of poking your finger with a sewing machine needle, but I think that would actually be pretty hard to do. Because of the way the machine is set up and because there's a presser foot, you would have to literally stick your finger under the needle in order for that to happen. If you're just moving your hand along while sewing, it's gonna run into the presser foot before it ever reaches the needle. Now, I'm sure that someone has done it at some point, but it's not likely to do it by accident at least. Now, what does happen pretty frequently, at least for me, is sticking myself with pin needles. I seem to do this rather often, and it's kind of painful. I do this when I'm pinning things at the table. I do things when I'm pinning while ironing. Sometimes I stick myself while trying to get something through the machine. I'll just like jab my hand right into the end of a pin while trying to move the fabric around. I do it all the time. So no matter what I do or how long I've been sewing, I seem to stick myself multiple times during every project. Now the second most common hazard for me is burning my fingers. I frequently burn my fingers when pressing a fold or a seam. Now my fingers don't directly come into contact with the iron, but I often touch the hot fabric too soon after it's been under the hot iron. Now this typically happens when I am pressing a very small fold and I want to make sure that I get it and pin it before it comes undone. I'll typically touch it too soon. The same thing happens when I'm trying to do a double fold and I press one side and then I want to flip it over again and start pressing that, and I do it too soon. I get a little impatient with this part. I mean, you'd think I'd learn, but apparently not. The other thing that happens sometimes is that I get burnt by steam. Now, when I'm using interfacing that maybe requires that I put a damp cloth down or use of steam and to hold the iron in place for a while, sometimes while I'm holding the fabric, I get my hands too close and then I burn my fingers that way. And again, you'd think I'd learn, but I don't. So the third hazard, unfortunately, is cutting fingers. I have cut my fingers while cutting fabric. Now, while the rotary cutter was the most dramatic incident of cutting my fingers, I have also managed to cut them with the scissors somehow too. With the rotary cutter, it's really easy to cut your fingers because it's extremely sharp and there isn't a natural protector that keeps your fingers out of the way while you're using it. One time I sliced off the edge of my thumb while using the rotary cutter. I was using the acrylic ruler and I had lined it up to cut a straight edge right along the ruler just like it's made to, but while I was holding the ruler, I accidentally slipped my finger over the edge of the ruler right where I would be cutting, and I didn't even realize that I had done that until I accidentally cut off a small chunk of my finger. I wasn't really paying attention to the danger or being extra cautious like I should have been. Luckily, it was a small thing and just keeping it clean and covered with a bandage was all that was really needed, and it was healed within a week. But it could have been more serious. I did a similar thing with the scissors once. While I was trying to hold up the fabric with my left hand while cutting with my right, I ended up putting my hand in the way of the scissors and I nicked the inside of my finger. Now, it was about the size of a paper cut, so not a big deal, but it did sting. Now, sewing might not be the place that you expect to get hurt, but you definitely can. So it's really important to be mindful of what you're doing, be extra cautious, and pay attention to where you're putting your hands. Now, they do make some gloves that are designed to help prevent your hands from getting injured. Some geared towards heat, some geared towards cutting and pinning, but personally I find that kind of difficult to use because the bulk of the gloves and everything just kind of makes it hard to operate, and then I can't feel things properly, and so it's difficult for me to put things together. But if you're particularly worried about potential hazards, then you may want to look into getting a pair. So the third thing that I wish I had known is to check twice before cutting. Now this may seem like a small thing, but I can't tell you the number of times that I have ruined a project or messed up fabric because I thought I had it all figured out only to cut it and realize that it's too small or something doesn't fit right. Or what usually happens, I cut something on the wrong side of the fabric or put the pattern the wrong direction and then it doesn't go together right. Granted, this is likely less common if you're not making your own patterns, but still it's a good habit to get into. No one wants to waste fabric or run the risk of not having enough for your project. One common mistake I make is typically when I fold the fabric in half trying to cut two pieces at once. Now this can be a big time saver, but it's also a place where error can occur. Some items don't work well with this approach, especially when opposites are involved. And this is typically where I end up making mistakes. So main takeaway, it's always a good idea to double check before you cut anything. It will save you a lot of time, a lot of stress and headache.
And potentially a lot of fabric too.
Number 4, take your time and do it right the first time. That may seem a little self-explanatory, but trust me on this one. Try not to be in a hurry when sewing if you can help it. It's worth the extra time to make sure that things are precise and correct. Trust me. It will definitely save a lot of time if you take the extra time either before or during your project in comparison to what it would take to fix a mistake, if it's even possible to fix the mistake. So many times I've cut things wrong or gotten sides reversed and ended up with unusable pieces of fabric. Sometimes this has even held up projects because it resulted in not having enough fabric left to do the cut. While sewing things together, it is equally important to ensure that you're sewing the correct thing in the correct place and in the correct way. While seam ripping is always an option, it takes a lot of time and it can be a somewhat painful process, quite literally if you end up with hand cramps. So it's a lot better to do it right the first time. Trust me, it's a lot less of a hassle to slow down and double check, maybe even triple check, before diving into whatever it is you're going to do. Number 5. Change the needle often. When I first started sewing, I had no idea when I should change the needle, and I assumed that it would last quite a while. Therefore, it would be a while before I needed a replacement, unless I broke a needle, of course. However, this is not correct, and failing to change the needle often can lead to sewing problems such as skipped stitches, uneven stitches, snagging, thread bunching or knotting, thread breakage, seam puckering, and overall poor machine performance and a less polished finish. It can also sometimes lead to loud or clunky sewing. The needle can actually dull quite quickly, especially after frequent use. Additionally, using materials such as Insulbrite, which contains metal, can dull the needle even faster. A dull or bent needle is what causes all of these problems. So how often should you change your needle? Well, that largely depends on how much sewing you're doing and how often. If you rarely sew, consider changing it every 3 months. Otherwise, a good rule of thumb is to change it for each new project. It's just good practice to start each new project with a fresh needle. However, it isn't necessary to change the needle every time you pop over to do a quick little hem or alteration. In these cases, just keep an eye on how long and how much sewing has been done with that needle, and change it when it's been used for several small projects or what might equate to 6 or 7 hours of sewing when added up. So number 6, clean your machine often. When I first started sewing, I had no idea when my machine should be cleaned, and I certainly had no idea that failing to clean it was causing some of the stitching problems. Similar to changing the needle, your machine should be cleaned regularly in order to optimize your machine's performance, prevent damaging the machine, ensure that your machine lasts a long time or at least does not deteriorate more quickly than necessary, prevent parts from drying out, and prevent stitching problems such as skipped stitches. Failing to clean your machine regularly can lead to poor machine performance and significantly reduce the life of your machine. So why does it need to be cleaned, and what exactly does that entail? Well, a disturbing amount of lint from the fabric collects underneath the needle plate and around the bobbin container and hook race and all around those parts of the machine. It needs to be cleaned before too much of it builds up. Furthermore, certain parts of the machine need to be re-oiled regularly to ensure proper functioning. It is best to put a drop of oil on the hook race or wherever your machine tells you to each time the sewing machine is cleaned. If you sew frequently, especially if it's daily, it's best to clean your machine at least once a week. If less often, however, try to aim to clean your machine after every project or after several smaller projects such as hemming or alterations. Your machine manual will tell you how often to clean your machine, how often it needs to be re-oiled, and where to put the oil. To clean the inside of your machine, remove the needle plate, bobbin, and bobbin case until the fixed parts of the machine are all that remains. Take a small lint brush, which was likely included with your machine, and just pick up all of the lint. Double check corners and areas where lint could potentially collect. Once all of the lint is cleaned out, reapply 1 drop of oil in the location specified in your sewing machine manual. So number 7 is to add extra space and extra seam allowance. Sometimes you get the measurement wrong. Sometimes you end up with things tighter than you expected once you sew it together. And then what do? You've already cut it now. It's always good practice to add just a little extra space just in case.
Extra space just in case.
You can always cut more, but it's really hard to add it back after you've already cut it. For example, I typically use the overcasting presser foot and overedge stitch to sew my seams, and this only really needs about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I'll go ahead and measure a 1/2 inch seam allowance anyway, just in case, so there's extra space and I don't run the risk of it being too tight. When sewing circle skirts, I typically add seam allowance on both sides of the 1/4 circle pattern, even though only one is technically needed. This way, I have about an extra inch of fabric to work with, just in case. It can always be trimmed after the piece is cut, but this way I don't run the risk of cutting out a large piece of fabric only to learn that there isn't enough room for error. Trust me, it will make your life easier. Number 8, hand sewing. Sometimes hand sewing is needed. When you start sewing, it's tempting to think that you'll spend all of your time at this amazing machine that you have.
It's only natural.
But the reality is that in addition to all the time spent cutting and pressing, you'll also probably need to do some hand sewing. Hand sewing will be needed for sewing buttons, snaps, beads, and other embellishments. Additionally, not all projects or parts of a project will fit underneath the machine. Sometimes what is needed to be sewn is also too thick. For example, when making my bike trunk cooler bag, I had to hand sew the bias tape because there were too many layers of fabric to be able to flatten it enough to get the rectangle underneath the machine. Hand sewing can also be necessary in instances where extra delicacy is required. It's less fun and glamorous, but it is a reality of sewing nonetheless. All right, second to last one. Number 9, there's an easy way and there's a hard way. Use the one with less math and less measuring.
A couple of the things that I did when I first started sewing were actually kind of ridiculous.
I did several things the hard way, very unnecessarily. One of the biggest was when I would measure and iron double folds. I would often take one edge of the fabric, measure say a 1/2 inch with a sewing gauge, take the iron and press that down along the whole edge, and then fold it over again and iron that down.
There is a much easier way.
Eventually, I saw someone do it the easier way, which made a whole lot more sense. And then I was frustrated with myself for not doing it the way that was much simpler and should have been obvious. The easier way is to fold a piece of fabric in half and then press that. Then you can open the fold and fold the outer edges toward the crease that was just made and press it again. Then you fold both together over the original center crease one last time, and voila! You get an even double fold without having to do a bunch of unnecessary measuring. A similar principle can sometimes apply to cutting as well. Rather than measuring, you can sometimes figure out what you need to cut by simply folding the fabric in half or in quarters. For example, when doing a circle skirt, it is easier to fold the fabric in quarters and find the measurement for a quarter circle and cut that, rather than dealing with the whole large piece of a circle skirt. So, when you're sewing, don't be afraid to ask yourself if there is an easier way. It just might save you a ton of time and headache. Now, the 10th and final tip is to stop watching the needle while you're sewing. Now, I've been there, I get it. It's so tempting to watch the needle when you first start sewing. It's kind of fascinating, watch it go up and down and do its magic. However, this is not helpful to ensuring a smooth sewing process, even stitching, or a straight line when you sew. The thing is, the needle isn't going anywhere. It doesn't do any good to watch it because it doesn't move. It does nothing to help your sewing. I spent a long time watching the needle and wondered why it was so hard to get a straight line. Eventually, someone told me. Instead of watching the needle, keep a close eye on the fabric and the seam allowance as the fabric is fed through the machine. This is how you ensure a straight line when sewing. You have to make sure that the fabric stays in alignment with the seam allowance the entire time the fabric is being fed through the machine. This is a game changer in terms of improving your stitches and getting those nice straight stitches and seams. And don't be afraid to pause and check the stitching once it's gone through to make sure all is well or make adjustments as needed. Well, there you have it. That's 10 things I wish I knew at the beginning of sewing. Now, if you found this video helpful and informative, please give it a like. If you're new to sewing, let me know in the comments what's one thing that you learned from today's video. And if you've been sewing a long time, let me know in the comments what one thing you wish you knew when you first started sewing. For example, hand sewing will be needed for sewing. So number 6, that's 7. Oh dear.